Welcome to Abraham Lincoln's World. My name is Ed Steers. I'm the author of several books on Abraham Lincoln, including Blood on the Moon, The Assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and a series of books on the 7 generations of Lincoln families in America, beginning in 1637 and ending in 1865. I've just recently returned from narrating a tour of Mr. Lincoln's Washington and thought that I'd share a few of these more interesting sites with you in some of these videos. The first site that I want to talk to you today about is the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. Perhaps not many of you know of this or have been there. It is located at 1313 New York Avenue, only about 3.5 blocks from the White House, an easy walk. It's known today as the Lincoln Church because it is the church where Abraham Lincoln and his family worshiped during his 4 years and 5 weeks of his presidency. The church dates back to 1793 in the construction of the White House, when James Hoban, the architect, imported a large group of Scottish stonemasons who he contracted with to help build the White House. Now, these Scottish stonemasons were Presbyterians, and they held their church services on the grounds of the White House in one of the very large tool sheds. When the White House was completed in 1800, they moved into the Treasury Department while they constructed a church at 14th and F Street. And that church lasted until 1859, when they built a church on the current site at 1313 New York Avenue, and it became known as the New York Avenue Church. In 1951, the church was demolished, but rebuilt on exactly the same architectural plan as the original church was. And that is the church which exists today and is known as the Lincoln Church. If Lincoln were to return to Washington, he would easily recognize the church as being the one that he attended. When the Lincolns arrived in Washington and set up housekeeping at the White House following Lincoln's inauguration on March 4th, Mary Lincoln sent to the church requesting a seating chart to see if there were any pews that were available. In those days, many churches would rent pews in the front to people who were willing to pay an annual fee for them, putting them closer to the altar. Now, Mary was a Presbyterian, and the Lincolns attended the First Presbyterian Church in Springfield, Illinois. So when they came to Washington, Mary looked up the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church and decided that would be their church during Lincoln's presidency. And when she received the seating chart from the minister, Dr. Reverend Gurley, she noticed that one of the pews in the front was vacant. And it turned out to be the pew that was recently occupied by the President James Buchanan. And so she told her husband to rent that pew for the duration of their stay in Washington. And if my memory serves me correct, I believe he paid an annual fee of $50 for the pew. Now, what's interesting is when the church modernized at the end of the 19th century interiorly, they replaced all of the existing pews, but had the foresight and wisdom to keep the Lincoln pew and to keep it in its original location, which is where it now sits today. So when you visit the church, you can see the original Lincoln pew. You can even reserve that pew on Sunday morning church services if you so wish. It's a very nice gesture that the church provides to both its members and to non-members. Also in the sanctuary, if you look up, you will see a very large, beautiful stained glass window dedicated to Abraham Lincoln. Now, you'll notice in this window that Lincoln is standing during prayer. And the legend goes that Lincoln, having grown up in a small Southern Baptist sect known as the Free Will Baptists, claimed that they stood during prayer. And I understand that the Presbyterians kneel when they pray. So Lincoln was very conspicuous, apparently, by the fact that he was the only one standing in the church during prayer. And so when it came time to design this stained glass window, they decided to depict Lincoln standing during prayer. Other associations of Lincoln with the church are in the downstairs area where there are offices and meeting rooms. There's a lovely green settee that was originally in the office of Dr. Phineas Gurley, the church's pastor. And on occasion, when Gurley held Wednesday evening prayer services in the small chapel on the lower level, Lincoln would attend. And because his presence would be so disruptive to the congregation, people wanting to meet and greet him or pester him for patronage, Gurley decided that they pulled the little settee next to the door to the chapel, open the door slightly, and let Lincoln sit on the settee and listen to Gurley's sermons and the church service unbeknownst to the congregation, and therefore not at all disruptive. And when it was over, the service was over, Lincoln would simply slip out the back side door of the church and return to the White House. Also, downstairs in one of the meeting rooms is an extraordinary document written in Lincoln's own handwriting. It's dated July the 14th, 1862, and it's often referred to as the first Emancipation Proclamation. What it really is a compensation bill. Lincoln attempted to compensate slave owners in the 4 border states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Now, there were 432,000 slaves in those 4 states that had a value of approximately $172 million. And so what Lincoln proposed is that the federal government purchase those 432,000 slaves in the 4 border states, thereby freeing them and at the same time not disrupting the economy of those 4 states. But unfortunately, Lincoln's bill was rejected by the legislatures of the 4 states and by his own party in the Congress. Lincoln very much wanted to attempt compensated emancipation for the entire South. There were 4 million slaves that it was estimated were worth about $3.5 billion. And Lincoln proposed that, once again, the United States, if they were successful in compensating the 4 border states, that perhaps now they could convince the 11 states in rebellion to accept compensation for their slaves. Lincoln understood that 4 million slaves, whose property value was worth about $3.5 billion, if emancipated or slavery was abolished, would be enormously disruptive to the economy of the South. And rather do that, he wanted to compensate slave owners in the South. And by so doing, bring the Civil War to an end, reunite the country, and protect the economy of the South at the same time. Of course, the South would have no part of it, nor would the United States Congress. Not 1 penny to slave owners is what the Congress said to Lincoln. Well, I told you that this bill, written in Lincoln's own hand, was dated July the 14th, 1862. At that very same time, Lincoln already had drafted the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And so when compensated emancipation failed, only 2 months later, Lincoln pulled the trigger and issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. If the Congress in the South wouldn't have it his way for compensation, he would then go for complete emancipation as a war measure. And so the South lost out a wonderful opportunity to both be compensated and join the Union and end the terrible Civil War. The document was originally disposed of, but a porter at the White House found it in the outgoing trash. So the story goes, and he took it home where it descended in his family. In 1951, the Rabbi Norman Gerstenfeld of the Washington Hebrew congregation learned that the document was for sale. And so he went to his good friend Barney Balaban, who happened to be president of Paramount Studios, and Balaban's parents were members of Rabbi Gerstenfeld's Washington Hebrew congregation. And he suggested to Balaban that he purchase this emancipation document or compensation bill and then donate it to the New York Avenue Church as a gesture of ecumenical friendship and cooperation. And Balaban apparently was only too happy to do it, and he purchased the document and presented it to the church, where it is now on display. A remarkable document. There are two other associations I want to briefly mention with this very famous church. The first is one of their ministers, Dr. Peter Marshall, who was pastor from 1937 to 1949. From 1947 to 1949, he served as chaplain of the United States Senate. Peter Marshall rose to become probably the most famous preacher in America during the 1940s. He was Billy Graham, Bishop J. Fulton Sheen, and Norman Peale all wrapped up in one. He was so popular that on Sunday mornings, lines would form for several blocks outside the church to get in just to hear his sermons. And the church then was forced to keep its doors closed, allowing only members in up until 15 minutes before the church service was to begin, at which time they would throw the doors open and allow anyone in the general public to come in. Peter Marshall died suddenly from a heart attack as a young man in 1949, and his wife decided to write his biography in a book she titled A Man Called Peter. That book became so famous that it remained on the New York Times bestseller list for 128 straight weeks. And then in 1955 was made into a very famous motion picture, again using the title from the book A Man Called Peter. And the last association I want to tell you about with this church involves President Dwight D. Eisenhower. In 1954, Eisenhower, along with his Postmaster General Arthur Summerfield, attended the church service on the Sunday closest to Lincoln's birthday, which happened to be February 7th, 1954. And it was a tradition that on the Sunday closest to Lincoln's birthday, the pastor would preach a Lincoln sermon. And George Dougherty, who was the pastor at the time, chose the topic for his sermon, One Nation Under God. President Eisenhower was so impressed by Dougherty's sermon that when he returned to the White House, he asked Summerfield to have legislation drawn up so that the words "under God" could be added to the Pledge of Allegiance. And so we now have in our pledge, one nation, indivisible, under God, with liberty and justice for all. I hope you enjoyed this little video and found it somewhat informative. So visit the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church and see the church where the Lincolns worship. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.